So I'm the co-director of the Center for European Studies at Carleton University in Ottawa, which is one of the two partners organizing this event along with the University of Latvia. And I'd like to first express my thanks and pleasure at working with our colleagues at the University of Latvia, Professor Tatiana Mirovska, who's with us today, and Tom's ROSTOKS, who's also with us today, and Dr. Zena Zabote, who's not able to be with us today, have all worked, I think, very hard to bring this together. And it has been an excellent example of transatlantic cooperation. It's been a great pleasure to meet. And I just want to say that publicly to all of you at the University of Latvia. So today, our first panel is I think going to sort of set the stage for the whole conference. We have 4 speakers, and the first speaker will introduce the topic, and then the other three speakers are going to look a bit at the context and background of the current conflict, how we got here, why we're here with what we're calling in this workshop the collapse of the European security regime as we have known it. So I'll begin with introducing our first speaker, who is Mr. Ivars LASIS. And we're very pleased and privileged to have Mr. LASIS with us today. He's going to, he is the ambassador and current representative of Latvia at the Political and Security Committee of the European Union. So let me say a little bit about Mr. LASIS' background. He has extensive experience in international relations and diplomacy, including at various postings at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Latvia and its diplomatic missions in Israel and Ireland. And he has particular expertise in the field of security policy, having served as director of the Security Policy Department at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He also has had postings to NATO and was deputy permanent representative at the Latvian delegation to NATO up between 2016 and 2020. So I think he comes to us very well qualified to give us this initial kind of briefing and overview that he's going to do. So Mr. LASIS, over to you.
Thank you, Joan, DeBARDELEBEN. Thank you very much, and a very good morning and a good afternoon to all of you. And thank you for inviting me to speak at this workshop. It's my privilege and pleasure. And indeed, as the previous speakers have already pointed out, that the harsh reality is that there is a war of aggression raging at our doorstep. Since February 24, the European and global security landscape has completely changed, and we are witnessing continued escalation by Russia every day. Russia continues the brutal invasion of Ukraine, which it started in 2014, and it is waging a war of aggression against one of its neighbors. Even Putin himself has publicly acknowledged the truth that Russia is at war with Ukraine, although we know that the narrative is changing because of the Russian losses, and now NATO and the West are to blame. But now comes the question, is Russia a threat to Europe, transatlantic security? And my very short answer would be yes, it is, and it has been a threat. But how did we get there? I believe we collectively failed to see Russia the way it was, revanchist, aggressive, and a threat to our security. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, we, the West, collectively were willing to embrace Russia and to help its democratization efforts. We saw Russia as a partner and chose to engage Russia. We also believed in Russia's good intention policy towards its neighboring countries, the Western society, and its values. Also, we believed that Russia wanted to pursue its internal democratization process. Both NATO and the EU were willing to embrace Russia, and this effort was unprecedented, I would say. Just 2 examples regarding NATO and the EU efforts. NATO's willingness to engage with Russia resulted in the creation of NATO-Russia Council. Later, NATO decided to build a strategic partnership with Russia. And in the first statement of NATO-Russia Council, it was agreed that NATO member states and Russia will work as equal partners in many areas of common interest: terrorism, crisis management, non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, arms control, theater missile defense, search and rescue at sea, military-to-military cooperation and defense reform, civil emergencies, very many areas, and there were very many working groups at NATO. I was working at that time at NATO, so participating in those discussions with Russia. We even did a joint threat assessment with Russia at NATO. On the EU side, similar efforts in the early 2000s. The EU and Russia were both aiming at strategic partnership. There were even 2 summit-level meetings between the EU and Russia. Also, the concept of the 4 common spaces for greater integration was agreed at the EU-Russia St. Petersburg summit in May 2003. The 4 common spaces covered a wide range of policies, economic issues, including environment, freedom, security, justice, external security, research, and education. It was only 20 years ago, but it clearly shows that our willingness to engage with Russia and embrace it was not reciprocated and was rebuffed. And part of this engagement was creating dependencies, because there was belief that the more closely knit we are, the less likely that conflicts would emerge. But creating economic dependencies was a mistake for which we are paying dearly now. Needless to say that the pipeline diplomacy and the Nord Stream project made us vulnerable, and we see the consequences now. So it was not the lack of formats and structures through which to engage and talk to Russia or to cooperate with Russia. It was Russia's disregard for the sovereignty of other states. It wanted privileged rights. After the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, many believed that peace in Europe was a certainty and took it for granted. On August 8, 2008, when Russia started Europe's first 21st century war, we were pushed to revisit our approach. And now, looking back to the events of 2008, it is obvious that Russia was only testing our reaction, the reaction of the West and other international players. And I would say that the international reaction was quite muted, and Russia faced only a few negative consequences. But Russia respected strength and weakness, not weakness. The attack on Georgia came only 6 months after the Bucharest summit, when NATO acknowledged Ukraine and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations, but did not grant them the membership action plan. The weak international response to Russia's war in Georgia gave the green light to Russia's assault on Ukraine in 2014, and now this year. In fact, there were a number of warning signs or signals we did not react to strong enough, misunderstood them, or hoped Russia would not cross those lines. Russia always had difficulty to accept the loss of the glory of the Soviet Empire it created. And in 2007, Putin, in his Munich Security Conference speech, loudly and clearly defined Russia's perception of the new security realities in Europe and the world. His speech came as a shock to those who had invested substantial effort in working with Russia to include it in a post-Cold War global stability system. Russia has never been able to either coexist peacefully with other countries or to reconcile with its colonial past. It has to be recognized that Russia was never comfortable with Ukraine's independence, and Crimea's annexation in 2014 was a blunt demonstration of Russia's imperialist aspirations. Creating an armed conflict in Donbass was Russia's strategy to gain leverage over political process in Ukraine and to counter Ukraine's willingness to move closer to the EU and NATO. It was part of a pattern to create frozen, unresolved conflicts. Russia's malign influence and the hybrid threat also was Russia's foreign policy unwritten doctrine. It has always been to use the vulnerabilities of other countries, try to control governments, and to meddle in domestic politics of neighboring countries and beyond. And as Russia became more authoritarian, it gradually also tried to make sure that democratization and reforms in neighboring countries fail, and these countries stay in Russia's sphere of influence. The EU's response to these efforts was the Eastern Partnership policy to bring closer to Europe countries like Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. But no doubt, I believe, Russia always respected the language of force and respected those who project strength and are aware of their power. While Russia has been exploiting vulnerabilities of neighboring countries, it has also interfered in the EU and NATO member states. And there is Now, growing understanding and realization that it is very important to strengthen our own resilience, invest in deterrence, and stand up against Russia's machinery of propaganda and disinformation. I know that the other sessions will look forward to how to deal with Russia, but just a few words from my side as well about the approach we should have now. I believe we need to change the paradigm, how we deal with Russia. The principles on which we based our approach so far are null and void, including the EU 5 principles. We should treat Russia as an aggressor and a threat to our security. Russia has always treated the West, NATO, and EU countries as adversaries, even enemies. We should continue support to Ukraine, financial, military, economic. Ukraine needs to win this war, and non-recognition of the referenda and of the decisions Russia may take after this referenda is very important. Support to other countries in the neighborhood, and we need to invest in resilience in those countries. Further pressure on Russia, deterrence, including sanctions, continue work on accountability, reconstruction of Ukraine, ask for reparations from Russia. Strategic independence from Russia. Earlier, we were looking for synergies. Now we need independence from Russia. And we need to invest in our own resilience. We need to do this together with our allies, strategic partners, NATO, EU, and like-minded countries across the globe. We should continue the outreach to our countries, to other countries in Africa and the global South, and continue to isolate Russia internationally, to explain our position on Russia's aggression and its impact on the international rules-based order. I also wish to point out the importance of the transatlantic link and unity and the role the US and Canada play in the European security. We welcome the decisions of NATO, which were taken in Madrid, and are grateful for the presence of NATO forces on the eastern flank. And my special thanks to Canada for the commitment to Latvian security and leading the EFP battle group in Latvia. I would like to finish now with what my former colleague Zane Petra started with in her introductory remarks, and quote EU Commission's President Ursula von der Leyen, who in her State of the Union speech earlier this month said that one lesson from this war is we should have listened to those who know Putin, to the Russian journalists who exposed the crimes and paid the ultimate price, to our friends in Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and to the opposition in Belarus. We should have listened to the voices inside our union, in Poland, the Baltics, and all across the Central and Eastern Europe. I will stop here, and I will be happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon. I will probably start with something that I did not include in my introductory remarks, and that is a realization that these are extraordinary times when you hear strong-worded statements from diplomats and very often somewhat more muted statements from academics. And not so long ago, it used to be the other way around, where academics would complain about diplomats issuing smooth statements, sometimes devoid of substance. And today, this was with Mr. LASIS' statement, that was clearly not the case. And I assume that his statement might be worded more strongly than any of the following statements. But having said that, I will address several points in my introductory remarks. First of all, I will address the question, well, has European security order collapsed? And I think there are 2 points to make here. First is that European security order as post-Cold War security order didn't really exist. It was fluid and it was in the process of transformation. Let's just keep in mind that so many Central and Eastern European countries joined European Union and NATO. So European security order was changing, and arguably it was, if Russia wanted to keep its sphere of influence in the so-called near abroad, it was on the losing side. And the other point here is that even if we are, I think it wouldn't be correct to say that the European security order has collapsed. In fact, if we talk about some of the basic rules of the game, such as respecting other countries' sovereignty and territorial borders, then, this war in Ukraine, I think, is partially aimed at restoring some ground rules for state behavior in Europe. Obviously, Ukraine fights for its sovereignty and its right to exist and have a separate identity. But at the same time, we should also keep in mind that there are broader questions and issues at stake. And European security order and restoring this those basic ground rules that borders matter and states should not interfere too much in each other's sovereignty. That remains an important principle, and I believe that it is worth defending that principle. So I'm very glad that Ukraine is receiving all sorts of help from Europe and beyond. Then also I will reiterate the point which was made by Mr. LASIS, that we were probably not paying enough attention to Russia. For example, if you were an academic in a Western academic institution, why would you study Russia? Obviously, a lot of people continued to do that after the end of the Cold War and the breakup of the Soviet Union. But Russia wasn't given the attention that it truly deserved. And especially after the tragic events of 9/11 in the United States, the academic and think tank attention shifted towards terrorism, rightly so. But in that context, I think we were just not paying attention to what Russia was doing. And Russia was actually threatening and to some extent was trying to overthrow the existing security order in Europe since 1990s. There were frozen conflicts since early 1990s in Europe, and those were never resolved. Russia never wanted to resolve them in true faith. It participated in the international mechanisms that were created allegedly to solve those conflicts on the territory of Georgia and in Moldova, but Russia never really wanted to solve them in a proper sense. And then, of course, since 2008, this type of errant behavior has accelerated. And if European security is partly based on the assumption that states have borders and other states respect them, then Russia has not respected this basic principle since early 1990s. And it just got worse over the past 10 or 15 years with Russia's aggression against Georgia and Ukraine. And this year, this problem came to a head because apparently we now realize that unless we take a stand together with Ukraine, then there will be further violations of state borders. Okay, and then I will make three more observations about this conflict. as relations between Russia and the West progressively deteriorated, you can take Vladimir Putin's speech in Munich conference in 2007 as the starting point, or it could be the war in Georgia in 2008. But over the past years, it became clear that that this is a conflict between Russia and the West, where neither of the sides can give up on their essential interests. So European Union and NATO could not shut its door to new member states. NATO had the open door policy towards European states that wanted to join NATO, and NATO membership has grown over time. The same with European Union, and it was an important principle that European states could choose their partners with whom they want to have. With whom they want to conclude economic agreements and form security and defense partnerships, and that was clearly something that Russia rejected. In Russia's views, and these views were formulated very clearly early in this year, in January. According to Russia's worldview, there are just two types of states. There are sovereign states like United States, Russia, and China, and then there are vassal states. And great powers can interfere in domestic affairs and in foreign policy of those so-called vassal states as great powers see fit. And this clash of principles that, well, the Western states represented one view that states should be able to choose their partners, and Russian view that states cannot choose their partners. That came to a conflict. The second observation that I'll make is that clearly there was a misperception of intentions and capabilities. And I believe that this war and decision-making which resulted in this war will be studied for decades, as I said before, because Russia overestimated its power. It underestimated Ukraine's power and readiness to fight for its survival, while in the West, we largely misperceived Russia's intentions, and we didn't think that the things that Russia does during the war in Ukraine, we thought that these would not be possible in the 21st century. So, so I think that misperception is a key element of the story that brought us here. And my last point is about what I would call cultural roots of Russia's domestic politics and foreign policy. In a few years' time, in retrospect, we might probably think that that Ukraine war was about strategic issues and Russia's strategic interests, and also NATO's and EU's strategic interests regarding Ukraine and eventually weakening Russia. But I think that the key problem for Russia has been that Russia's neighbors have understood fairly well what Russia represents. I believe that for many people and analysts in the West, the behavior of Russian troops, the way they treat Ukrainian prisoners of war, the way they treat Ukrainian civilians, the blatant disregard for the lives of Russian troops, and right now there are tens of thousands of mobilized Russians who will be sent to front lines without adequate equipment and without adequate training. So there's just this blatant disregard for human lives. And for many analysts in the West, this comes as a surprise, while some of Russia's neighbors, like Baltic states, like Ukraine, like Georgia, we have memories of that. And I personally did not believe that this kind of behavior on Russia's part would be possible in the 21st century. But apparently it is possible. So the sheer cruelty of the Russian, so-called Russian world is just breathtaking. And Russia's neighbors would be reluctant to accept being part of Russia's sphere of interests because the consequences of being ruled by Russia are just horrific. So I think that the cultural element of this war, because Russia's war reflects what Russia is, and I think many people in Russia's neighboring states have seen that already, and they understand what Russia represents, and Russia's behavior unfortunately comes as a surprise to so many analysts in our Western partner states. So I'll stop here and we'll pass the floor back to Joan.
Well, thank you so much for this warm introduction, and thank you to all the organizers for giving me the opportunity to participate in this important panel. It truly is a great pleasure and a privilege to join you today and to add my reflections on this important question of how we got here. And it seems to me that a good starting point for trying to answer this question is to try to define what here means in this context. On this point, I would certainly agree with many experts, including previous speakers today, who argue that what we are witnessing today is not just the most spectacular and grave incident of interstate violence in Europe since 1945, although that in itself is serious enough, of course. But more fundamentally, we are witnessing a systematic threat to the normative fabric of international society. By that, I mean the global rules that we had come to take for granted, and also specific provisions of the Euro-Atlantic security regime that was created, or at least that we attempted collectively to create after 1989, that we thought we could trust and we thought could provide security in the transatlantic space. And we now begin to see that this is deeply, deeply weakened through Russia's actions. And I would argue this has implications in multiple issue areas and will continue to affect the evolution of the normative fabric of international society for some time to come. Now, I think it's important to do something that previous speakers have also done, and to place our discussion in a broader historical context, in particularly by reminding ourselves that this invasion that started earlier this year is really the culmination of a series of violations of international norms by Russia. What's happening today is new in terms of the scale of violence, but is not new in terms of the pattern of behavior that we have seen from Russia. And yet, as again we've heard from previous speakers, the response coming from the international community, and particularly from the West, was quite weak for a long time. And that, it has to be acknowledged, despite the very strong arguments coming from a number of policymakers and experts, primarily from former communist countries, who were really calling for decisive Western, primarily NATO-led action against the increasingly aggressive policies of President Putin long before this invasion happened. The fact that it took so long for the international community, and particularly the West, to respond is due to a number of complex factors, and we couldn't possibly address all of them on this panel, although I know that many will be the subject of debate in the coming panels. But what I would like to do today is highlight a number of complicating factors that I believe are important because they have not gone away. So despite the clear unity that we now see when we look at the EU actions, when we look at the NATO response, clearly we see a remarkable degree of unity. And yet those underlying problems, and I would argue tensions, have not fully gone away. So we need to understand those because they could complicate long-term attempts to find an acceptable outcome to the war in Ukraine and redefine relations with Russia in the longer term. Now, in my remarks, I'd like to focus primarily on NATO, simply because I know there will be a lot of specific emphasis on the EU. So I think it helps to put this in a broader perspective, and also, of course, understanding that there are deep connections and parallels between the EU and the NATO response. Now, to understand that response, again, we need to step back for a moment and realize that this act of aggression is the most dramatic, but again, not the first episode in a long-term process by which President Putin has tried to implement a particular vision of Eurasian order designed to reaffirm Russia's influence in its quote-unquote traditional sphere of influence, and in so doing to achieve the twin aims of regaining great power status and recognition for that great power status. And according to President Putin's discourse, protecting Russia's identity and core values against the so-called false values that the West, under the leadership of NATO, has been allegedly trying to impose on the world, including the Russian, again, quote-unquote sphere of influence. This, again, we have seen with several episodes were mentioned before. We have seen this in the context of the aggression against Georgia, the process of trying to carve up Ukraine that was clearly obvious starting in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, and so on and so forth. And it all matters. It matters deeply because what is involved here is a violation of the most fundamental norms of international society. And there have been mentions to the UN Charter, the core provisions of the UN Charter. That's certainly the case, and it is vital. And also, we should not forget that there are violations of the core provisions of the non-proliferation regime, the Geneva Conventions, and so on and so forth. So this is a maritime law. This is really multi-layered, if you will, set of challenges to the international order. And at the same time, there are specific violations of the norms that are or were supposed to be at the heart of the Euro-Atlantic security regime created after 1989. And it's important to mention that we had the Paris Charter for a New Europe, we had the Budapest Memorandum of 1994 that were mentioned before. It's also important to keep in mind that what Russia is doing directly violates principles that were inscribed in the acts that Russia signed with NATO, including the 1997 Foundation Act and also the NATO-Russia Council. We need to keep this in mind because, of course, at the heart of the Russian narrative is the idea that NATO is clearly the aggressor. And yet, if we look at what's happening on the ground, we see that it is Russia that has been violating those core norms that it had agreed to respect. And here, perhaps I could insert a footnote as an educator, because I think this is something that is still not fully understood in many circles, including in the West. And as a teacher, I repeatedly have to debunk this myth in my classes with students who are very smart, very well-intended, but who still believe the Russian narrative that it was NATO that carried out the aggression and really that Russia had no choice. And this is a view that we have seen also being promoted by a number of Western scholars, including famously by Joan Monnet. It is something that I think we have to push back against because I think it will matter in terms of our ability to maintain a united front vis-a-vis Russia. Okay, so in this context, we see a delayed response by the West and a complicated response coming from NATO. Of course, all of that have changed with the invasion earlier this year when we see, and we have to admit, certainly there is remarkable unity on the part of the allies in terms of identifying Russia as a threat. They did so collectively, in terms of providing multi-layered support to Ukraine, in terms of reinforcing its defense posture and reinvesting in defense, and also relaunching or accelerating the process of enlargement with the invitations to the traditionally neutral states of Finland and Sweden. And all of these matter, they matter a great deal. They have revitalized and re-legitimized NATO after a very difficult period. In fact, some have argued that President Putin has been NATO's best friend in terms of reasserting its relevance in the contemporary security environment. But again, behind that, we should not forget that there are a number of unaddressed problems and challenges, and these matter because they could complicate efforts in the long term to find a solution to the war in Ukraine and to redefine relations with Russia. A number of those factors will be addressed in the coming panel, so I'm not going to say too much. And energy, of course, more broadly, economic concerns are absolutely vital. A couple of factors that I would like to highlight are, first of all, a gap in perceptions of threat within NATO, within the transatlantic security community. And we heard from previous speakers, and it is absolutely true to say that many experts, many policymakers from the former East, from the former communist countries, have long identified Russia as an existential threat, have tried to persuade their Western counterparts that this is the case, that more decisive action is needed. And yet for a long time, there was a reluctance coming from some West European allies who were attaching more importance to the more non-conventional threats coming from the southern flank. So that complicated the response for a long time. And then there are a number of interesting developments, and I would argue deeply problematic political developments linked to the rise of illiberal political forces within key members of NATO. That mattered because it undermined trust within NATO, and it also enabled a form of, let's say, rapprochement, or at least partial rapprochement between key NATO states and Moscow that again complicated the alliance's response. We don't have a lot of time, but let me briefly mention, predictably, the unhelpful policies of President Trump that undermined trust in the US's commitment to NATO. And that is, of course, to some degree, a problem that has been solved with the, of course, the changes, significant changes since the arrival of the Biden administration. But there is persisting concern in some circles that Trumpism, at least, is not dead, that we could have a very different president in a couple of years in the US, that could have a very powerful and dangerous impact on NATO. So we could say more on that later. But this is not the only problem. Because again, we do have the rise of illiberal political forces in a number of countries, and that generated problematic developments. And we can think about developments in countries like Hungary and Turkey, with unprecedented collaboration with Russia. And again, we should not assume that those are gone. Those developments persist, and they could complicate efforts by the alliance to maintain a united front vis-a-vis Russia, to define an acceptable outcome to the war. And to this, we should add a complicating factor that although Russia has few explicit supporters, not everyone in the international community supports the Western narrative and efforts to act against Russia. And if we look at, for instance, abstentions from key votes at the UN, we should recognize that there are a number of countries that are still sitting on the fence. And again, that means that in the longer term, the process of finding a solution to the current crisis may be more complicated than we would like. Much more to say, but in the interest of time, I will end here, and thank you so much for your attention, and again for giving me the opportunity to contribute to this event. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
In order to sort of assess the significance of Russia's invasion of Ukraine for European security order, I think it's very hard to make any overestimations. I think what we're facing today with Russia's war against Ukraine is nothing else than the breaking of one of the biggest taboos that we have had in European security order ever since the Second World War, which is the fact that territorial expansion, violating borders, annexing territories has no place in a European security order, because we know what it leads to. This is the experience of 2 world wars. Here we know what it leads to when you try to change borders by force, and certainly by the massive use of military force. So Russia here is violating one of the absolute core principles of European security order, one of the cornerstones that deals with the inviolability of borders, territorial integrity, sovereignty, and so on. And that's a principle that is of course, largely recognized in international law in general, not least of all in the UN Charter, but it's also in the Helsinki Final Act as a core principle for Europe specifically. It's in the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, in which Russia itself guaranteed the territorial integrity of Ukraine. So what we're facing is the biggest interstate war in Europe since the Second World War, with no doubt the biggest impact on the European security order. And of course, as one of the speakers has already mentioned earlier, this European security order was already very much in decay. It was already very much crumbling. But what is happening now is clearly sealing the end of the post-Cold War security order. Yeah? The whole story of how it has crumbled is maybe a rather complex story, where we may discuss different responsibilities on both sides. But it is entirely crumbling in the sense that the principles of the European border regime, the fact that you do not change borders by force, has disappeared. But next to that, there is also nothing left of the common norms you need in order to have a security order. Yeah? In that sense, there is also no common ground today for any negotiations, because there is no common set of norms on which European countries and Russia could possibly agree for any sort of negotiations. There's simply no normative ground left. We've also seen already in 2014 that there's actually no effective functioning security mechanism, collective security mechanism in Europe, on the basis of which you could try to solve a crisis. There's nothing left, which means there's only one option left, and that is one of confrontation. And one we should mention as well is the fact that there is a total collapse of the arms control regime, which is a story that has been going on for much longer, and is a major challenge for the future, in particular in the nuclear field. We have only the New START Treaty as the only treaty that basically survived the increasing tensions between Russia and the West over the last years. So the post-Cold War security order in Europe has entirely collapsed now. That is entirely clear with the ongoing war of Russia in Ukraine. Yet we should be extremely careful not to see Russia's war against Ukraine as the result of the decay of that security order. And I think this is where indeed the analysis of some academic scholars may become problematic. And the name of Mersheimer was already mentioned. He's by far not the only one, but he has become one of the most vocal representatives of that particular view, that what we see now today is actually a sort of proxy war, is the result of the tensions between Russia and the West. And I think there is something problematic with this approach. That is that even if you agree that the security order has been decaying for years, you still need to prove that the way the West has dealt with Russia in the past is the cause of what is going on. And I think that's an extremely difficult connection to make. And I think in academic debates, it's not happening enough. We're not even discussing that sufficiently. But if you listen to the narratives of the Russian regime over the last year and a half, you could say there have been two dominant narratives. One narrative was the narrative of red lines that Putin built up very consciously since the beginning of 2021, which was a narrative that was in the beginning rather vague. It was a narrative about red lines that the West could not cross and that would trigger a serious response by Russia. And the addressee of that narrative was very clearly the United States. It was the West in general, but the United States specifically. And it actually ended up in the unconditional demands that the regime formulated in December 2021, which were very clearly unrealistic demands that could not lead to any serious concessions. Now, it's interesting that this narrative happened and focused on NATO expansion, while NATO expansion had been offered, or the NATO membership had been offered to Ukraine already back in 2008, which was 14 years earlier. It's 14 years before the start of this war. So making that connection that the war follows from that offer once made in 2008 is quite far-fetched. And in particular, since this NATO membership was clearly not on the table, it was not on the agenda for anyone. No one was expecting that Ukraine would have joined NATO anytime soon. So it seems that many analysts tend to focus on this sort of narrative and understand the war in function of the narrative of the Kremlin. There's a second narrative that I think got too little attention indeed, and this is also a point of introspection for researchers of Russian foreign policy. And that was the narrative of the Kremlin on Ukraine as Russian lands, on Ukrainians and Russian being one people. I'm literally quoting Putin here. It was the narrative that basically denied the sovereign right of existence to Ukraine. And that was already very clear in the article that Putin published last summer, And that was very central to the two speeches he held on the eve of the invasion of Ukraine, yeah? But the emphasis is entirely about Ukraine not representing a state on its own and not having the right to sovereignty. And the way Russia started the war with an invasion on 3 different fronts made very clear that that the objective was the dissolution of the Ukrainian state and not less than that. I think a second problem with the idea that the war would follow from the tensions between Russia and the West is that it is very hard to see how the current invasion would have improved Russia's security concerns. Yeah? In many ways, Russia's security concerns have dramatically worsened. Russia is now confronted with a united European Union, with a united transatlantic front. NATO is expanding, Finland and Sweden are joining. NATO has been reboosted and as Alexandra said correctly, re-legitimized. Yeah, let's not forget that Macron was calling the NATO brain dead. Trump was campaigning and said that NATO was obsolete. This is a sort of rhetoric that has entirely disappeared as a result of the war. We've seen Germany going through its historic shift. And I think that is particularly important because the relations between Germany and the Soviet Union first, later on in Russia, are at the heart of the reconciliation between both. Yeah? The Ostpolitik of Brandt was a first important step in the reconciliation between the West and the Soviet Union, of the détente policy. And even later on, that axis between Berlin and Moscow remained extremely important for cooperation between the two. So the fact that this has gone entirely with the historic policy shift in Germany is very important to notice. And what is also important is that the addressee of all this is no longer the US. Yeah? The question here that is on the table is no longer a choice that the US has to make. Agency has, if you want, returned to Ukraine. It's Ukraine that decides now to what extent it wants to fight this war. I think it is crystal clear that this war will be fought to the end, that the chances of a negotiated agreement are extremely small, and Ukraine is willing to fight until the very end. What exactly that may mean needs to be seen, because they think it's a matter of survival and nothing less than that. So Russia's security concerns have also worsened in the sense that its attempt to see itself confirmed as a great power, that has not really worked. It doesn't come out of this war as a strong power. It has lost a lot of credibility among its partners. We've seen Xi Jinping coming up with critical questions, Modi expressing himself in a rather critical way, also Tokayev in Kazakhstan being rather critical about what is going on right now. So what I think we need to understand well is how Russia's decision to go to war is actually a mix of two elements that are entirely interwoven. Yeah? One is the sense of entitlement when it comes to Russia being a great power. And the other one is this identity argument that is strongly among the Russian leadership, that Russia can only exist when it is bigger than its current borders. So you could say the very idea of Russia being a great power is very much mixed with the idea of greater Russia, a Russia that is larger than its current borders. To conclude, I would like to add a couple of elements, a couple of ideas on how this impacts on the European Union. First of all, we have seen an unseen unanimity on sanctions that are far-reaching, that were in many ways unthinkable. We're now going towards the 8th package of sanctions. We've seen a European Union that was itself deciding to decouple itself from Russian energy, and has already taken quite important steps in that direction. There are, of course, some challenges on the table. One of them maybe the new Italian government. That remains to be seen, whether that will change anything to this united front. But that's something for the future. A second element that has changed considerably is the security role in which the EU finds itself. There has been the Versailles Declaration, a declaration of intention to boost defense capabilities and autonomy of the European Union, to reinforce the common security and defense policy. There has been the enormous role of the European Peace Facility, whereby already 2.5 billion euros went in military assistance to Ukraine. So there's a lot happening on that front that is reinforcing the EU's role. Of course, this is happening at the same time with the reboost of NATO. So we'll always see a degree of, if you want, co-opetition between NATO and the EU. Many things will have to be agreed in terms of division of tasks between the two. And a last point that really changes the EU's policy is the fact that its Eastern policy is changing again. First of all, the EU has returned very clearly to enlargement, which, for example, under the Juncker Commission was no longer on the table. There is not just discussion about enlargement of the Western Balkans again, but there is also the candidate status that was given to Ukraine, that was given to Moldova, that may be given one day in the near future to Georgia. And that may also imply the end of the Eastern Partnership, which was a policy that was exactly aimed at not giving countries membership, but giving countries a sort of privileged status as an associated country with the European Union. And it's very likely that we see a total redrawing of the Eastern policy of the European Union in the next couple of years. So the geopolitical commission that von der Leyen promised when she took office has gone probably much further than she could have imagined herself. The sort of language that the EU has to speak today is drastically different. But to conclude, I would like to say there's also enormous challenges on the table. In the short term, because of the current escalation we see over the referenda and the annexation that is coming up soon, but maybe also short-term challenges that may have to do, I think it can no longer be excluded in terms of a possible change of regime, or at least change within the regime, where also the EU and other actors will have to prepare themselves. But also in the longer term, there is this huge challenge of rethinking what a European security order under new conditions could look like, whatever these conditions will be in the very long term. And since that will also entail reopening the arms control agenda, the challenges, of course, for the EU will be tremendous. The EU is not there in the driver's seat, is not the country or is not the actor better that is going to be able to take the lead when it comes to these long-term ideas about a future European security order. Thank you.
So I think we have a number of issues laid out on the table, and I have some of my own questions, but we already have some questions in the question and answer box. So we'll immediately proceed to those just to give the audience a chance to have some input. But let me remind you, if you're listening to this, that you can pose a question in the question and answer box, which should be at the bottom of your screen. And if you would just type that in, that would be great. And you can either address it to a particular panelist, or you can address it to the whole panel. And then I'll just open it up to whoever wants to answer, or give everyone a chance to answer. Now, there, I think, are in essence here two questions, because two of them relate to something quite similar to one another. And I'll take that one first, which has to do with the fact that there isn't as much unanimity either in the West or in the world about the situation that's unfolded with the war in Ukraine as many of us in the West might have liked. And one of the questions points to possible enthusiastic large network of supporters who have in the West who have resisted sanctions. And is there a possibility, even in academic circles, is there a lack of unity in the West? I think there have been some comments on that in terms of, particularly Alexandra mentioned, in terms of the understanding in the West not being as uniform in terms of what's going on. But also, perhaps even more importantly, is that there are many countries around the world that are sitting on the fence and are not taking a clear position in terms of the response. And I think if I could ask the panel to address, especially that second question, I think the first one may have been addressed a little bit, but you could go back to that one too. In terms of how we got there, that there's less unanimity in the international order about the interpretation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We have countries such as China, India, South Africa, very important actors, not to mention also perhaps more understandably, many of the countries that are within Russia's sphere of influence, which have waffled. I mean, it's a bit easier to understand Central Asian countries, etc. But in terms of some of those larger powers, why has it turned out that they have not been more assertive in condemning Russia's action, or have even in many cases implicitly supported Russia's actions? And what does that tell us about the origins of this crisis of the international security order, or at least the European security order? And then if you also wish to address the issue of lack of unity in the West, and not only in countries that have been mentioned where there's some differences within the European Union, but also even within within countries like Canada, the United States, some of the countries that have been strong supporters of Ukraine, where there are still some dissenting positions. So I'll open that to anyone on the panel who wants to speak. If no one wants to start, I can. Alexandra, do you want to start, and then I'll go
if you wish. I mean, I can
I'll
get
go to
that
Ivars, and then I'll let Tom and Tom's have their input. So Alexandra.
Well, thank you so much, and it's a great question, or rather set of questions, and one that would preoccupy us for a long time, and it would be impossible to give a comprehensive answer right now. But I would highlight a couple of things and let's start with the global level. I think there are several dynamics here. And on the one hand, perhaps most obviously, you see China changing its position within the international order, becoming much more, if you're interested in contesting rather than participating in some of the arrangements of the international order. But this is not the only thing. And perhaps one thing that we have missed for a long time is, and if we look at abstentions within the UN, you will see, for example, that a large number of African states have abstained. Now, of course, there are economic considerations, and again, access to Russian energy, they cannot be ignored. But there is much more at stake, I would suggest, and it has to do with, first of all, a loss of, or at least decline of trust in the West, in Western institutions and in Western states, as a result of a number of actions, and I would in Africa in particular, for instance, the intervention in Libya was seen as a deeply problematic form of Western involvement. What I think we could call disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, again, undermined confidence in the West, and also there's a growing perception, if you will, of a gap, of a dissonance between principles that the West claims to uphold and its actual practices. And that did not help. There is something else going on, and that is the growing influence of Russia and China in parts of what we would call the global south. And again, I would take Africa as an example, African states, because I think very interesting evolution in terms of, on the one hand, Chinese economic influence, and the perception on the part of some African policymakers that is a much more acceptable influence because it does not come with a colonial past of the Western powers. And then Russia in the past few years has been very active in terms of trying to secure the support of a number of African countries, for instance, by providing military support. And that means that, again, the position of the West in a number of countries, of regions, is, I would argue, weaker. Support for the norms that we take for granted is not as strong as we would like to think. And also, it means that we need to think a lot harder about ways in which we can reassert, if you will, or try to regrow support for those norms. There are many different options on the table, and this starts, of course, with diplomatic efforts to engage more extensively with countries, particularly countries from the global south that we have not ignored, but perhaps not taken as seriously for a number of years, and also to try to provide some alternatives to the kinds of support provided by Russia and China. And I think the EU has been quite active, and I think it's made some very important gains, but I think we still have a long way to go in the future. As regards support in the West itself, as I mentioned before, I think a lot of that has to do, on the one hand, with economic concerns, and again, energy considerations cannot be ignored. But on the political front, I think the growing influence of illiberal political forces is something that should concern us, and the new Italian government was mentioned. That it opens, I think, some difficult questions about which way this country will go. We still have Hungary, again, playing a tricky game here. In a number of instances, for instance, has opposed, the Orban government has opposed assistance to Ukraine through NATO. In the US, we see something that we took for granted for a long time. Bipartisan support for NATO, for example, is not quite as strong, and that this is, again, in part thanks to the influence of Trump and his allies on the Republican Party. So I think we have a number of political and economic forces that have combined to bring us to a situation that is much more complex than we would like to think. And again, I think this has long-term implications that we'll need to face in the coming years. But thank you. I think there's much more we could say, but I'll stop here.
Maybe I can add a couple of things to that. I fully agree with what Alexandra said about the view of non-Western states, and indeed a sort of a lack of trust in Western institutions and Western policies, and for the right reasons in many ways. In many ways, this forms a sort of negative alliance, if you want. Yeah, this is a negative factor that brings many of these countries together, and most notably Russia and China, that may share a lack of trust in Western institutions, that may both be unhappy with the dominance of Western institutions and the US in particular. But I think what will be the big test for now is to see to what extent this alliance based on a negative factor, distrust vis-a-vis the West, will keep or not. And I think there are the first signs that it may not keep. China has little interest in a long-term instability, in a long-lasting war that may undermine many of its economic interests potentially. So I think we see possibly the first cracks in this sort of coalition, precisely because it's a negative coalition. And relations between Russia and China, for example, are based on a rather precarious balance, in the sense that Russia is still in principle the military dominant power, China is the economic power. They have recognized each other in these roles, but in particular when it comes to Central Asia, with many pieces of the puzzle now moving, the chances that this will lead to a sort of a collision and at least a clash of interests is I think quickly growing. So we'll have to see to what extent this coalition will hold indeed, but it's something that we need to have more attention for. That this is something that we have the tendency to look at this too much from a Western perspective somehow, and to forget that indeed a large part of the world may not necessarily be in favor of this invasion, but at least may be much more indifferent to it. And we should also not forget there is the factor of war opportunism, where some countries see the opportunity, for example, to buy cheap oil and therefore keep a rather low profile when it comes to their political position vis-a-vis the war.
Mm-hmm. Mr. LASIS, please.
Thank you. On this same issue about the countries sitting on the fence, I fully agree with the previous speakers about China. But China is also interested in the rules-based order. It has gained from this system. So I think it finds itself also in a kind of difficult situation. It wants to contest, but at the same time, it is probably this aggression, the war in Ukraine happened too early. It is not probably strong enough. Although it is powerful, it is growing, but it is not that strong enough yet. And that's why it is watching how the West and the allies are reacting to the war in Ukraine. That's why we need to continue the policy we have, the approach we have had so far, because China will apply the same vis-a-vis Taiwan. But we have also seen that the meeting in Samarkand, what it showed, that Putin was already sending signal that he understands the concerns of China and India. So it's not a shift, but there are small signals which are slightly different. But about the global South, indeed, that's a very difficult issue. Also, I believe it's the deep-seated resentment about the colonial past, and that is the underlying cause of why the countries are reacting the way they are. It's a conflict-ridden continent, and when this is happening in Europe, it's far away, and they do believe indeed that it's many of them, not all, that it's our problem. But there is one aspect how we need to approach it, because of course we need to explain this and why it happened. But I think one approach works best. It is explaining to those countries that sovereignty and territorial integrity and rules-based order is very important, and this is something to which they should listen. And this is they are quite receptive to this issue, because this is somehow we are trying to work hard on this in the UN, also the EU during its outreach. So we are working on this. I don't know if I can touch on the other issues. There was a question to me as well on the Russians crossing into.
Yeah, let's first see if Thomas has anything on this question, then I'll come back to you immediately. Just to finish up with this issue first.
Yeah, very quickly. I think that the rules-based order, one might say, is thin, and countries' support or lack of support for Ukraine is determined by many factors. For many countries, Russia is just more important than Ukraine. The relationship with Russia is more important, and I guess we just have to accept that. But at the same time, I also think that whether there's support for Ukraine or support for Russia in so many states outside Europe and North America, ultimately it may not matter all that much, because if EU and NATO will, and not just EU and NATO, but also other states that support Ukraine, if they will provide Ukraine with adequate support, the Ukrainians will eventually solve this problem. We don't really know yet the contours of how this may end, but it looks like at the end of this conflict, Ukraine will stand tall. It may very well be the case if they receive adequate support. While in Russia, the Russian president has set in motion processes that may easily lead to the downfall of the current regime in Russia, and we just have to take that into consideration. And my last point here is that at the start of the conflict, we just didn't, honestly, personally, I didn't know how successful Ukraine will be in fending off Russia's military aggression, because just half a year earlier, we saw what happened in Afghanistan. So Afghanistan's security forces, well, they were unable to stand their ground against the Taliban, and we didn't really know how well Ukrainians will perform in the military conflict. And when Ukrainian representatives at the start of the war, when they approached their Western counterparts, in some cases, the answer was something along the lines of, "Don't you worry, it will be over in 2 or 3 days." So there's very much there's a lot of siding with the winner going on as well. And if Russia will be losing this war, I don't think Russia will have many supporters in this camp. Thank you.
I'm going to turn, thank you very much, Tom. So I'm going to turn back to Mr. LASIS. There's a question about Putin's recent declaration of partial mobilization, causing an exodus of fighting age individuals and their families from Russia. And the question is, has Latvia experienced an increase in traffic at the border from Russia? Does Latvia possess the means to take in and assist these Russians? And does this situation pose any unique security or integration challenges for the country? So I'll turn that one over to you, please.
Thank you. Very quickly, well, I don't think there is any considerable increase in the numbers crossing into Latvia. Well, first of all, we stopped issuing visas already right after the war started, and then we stopped. We actually didn't allow any Russian tourists to cross into Latvia and then travel on further on to the EU. But after this mobilization decree by Putin, well, we also took a political decision that these people would not be allowed to come to Latvia, and they have heard it. So there are probably some numbers and people who have visas. They may try, but in general, this should not be happening, and we have a very political decision taken that the people should stay in Russia. They should go out and protest against this decision, and if they are against the war, they could have actually traveled away from Russia already before this decree was taken. So actually, they are probably not that much against the war. They just don't want to participate, and they want to watch it on TV. And it is a security threat indeed, because in future, Putin or whatever who is in power may decide that they also need to defend their compatriots abroad. But the important thing is that the people should stay in Russia and exert pressure on the regime to take a different stance. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that answer. There are a couple of questions now that actually relate more to some of the future panels, but I'd like to give our panelists here an opportunity to address them because the audience wants to know your views. And two of them relate to energy. One has to do with Canada's capability to help to fill Europe's energy gap as Europe tries to reduce its dependence on Russian imports. And the second question has to do with the damage to the gas pipelines that has occurred, which is some kind of, I guess, suspected sabotage now, and how the West might react to that. If you have any thoughts about that most recent kind of news development. So I know this is not necessarily your expertise, the area of energy, but I'm sure you're all very well versed in all of these dimensions. So if anyone would like to take on either one of those two questions. Any thoughts from anybody? Tom?
Sorry.
Yeah, Tom.
I can't really comment on the Canadian part. I'll leave that to the Canadians. But when it comes to the current pipelines, I think there is currently too little information and too little certainty about what has happened to really see what sort of reaction could follow and what would happen. Because I think there might be different explanations, and I think at this point we can only speculate about who is behind the sabotage of Nord Stream. I think this is really quite early to come up with any sort of final conclusions, because it's very hard to imagine that any of the parties has the capacity for the sabotage and has a real interest in doing that, including Russia, that has invested many billions in the construction of these pipelines, and it's at the same time means that sort of they would give up altogether the possibility of exporting any gas to Europe. The sabotage was not needed to stop the gas supplies, because currently there was no gas or virtually no gas streaming through the Nord Stream pipeline. So in that sense, this would not necessarily have an impact on Russia's gas exports as such. So in that sense, it remains quite hard to see under the current circumstances who has an interest in that. And I think we have to be quite careful with speculation. But it's of course a very clear wake-up signal for many European countries, how they have to protect and be very careful about a critical infrastructure. Yeah? But apart from that, I think we really have to wait and see what will come out of this.
Yeah, Thomas?
Yes. Obviously, we don't really know what happened. So it was sabotage. I think that much we know. But then who did this? Well, whoever in Russia did this, they're probably going to be quiet about this. But I think that Russia might actually be interested in doing this. And there are two things. One thing is that to demonstrate to the West that critical infrastructure, gas pipelines, internet cables are vulnerable. Of course, we knew that, and this has been a constant concern even since 9/11 attacks in 2001, because there were concerns that terrorists might target critical infrastructure, and now it's a state actor that might target critical infrastructure. So that was a clear signal to NATO, and that is also the reason why NATO issued this strong-worded statement. But the other point, I think, is that Russia might have an economic interest in doing this. I'm not sure about this, but Russia and its companies may have a contractual obligation to deliver gas through Nord Stream, but the gas wasn't delivered, so the pipeline was the tap was closed, and Russia wasn't probably fulfilling its contractual obligations. But guess what? There's force majeure. If the pipeline is blown up, then Russia cannot deliver gas through Nord Stream, even if it wanted to. So there might be an economic dimension there, but I do understand, obviously, that these were multi-billion euro projects that would be that's a lot of money that's going to waste. But Russia might have an economic interest there. Thank you,
Alexandra.
Well, thank you so much. And I can't really speak about the Canadian ability to play key role in energy in the coming years. Others know much more about this, so they will speak, no doubt, on the energy panel. I would echo what my colleagues have said in terms of the attacks on the pipelines, and certainly we have to be careful. We cannot jump to conclusions. It's still too early. We still don't have all the information. But I think, the broader term remains very relevant, which is that it's important to understand that energy has been weaponized systematically. So any response to this crisis will need to include a strong response on the energy front. More broadly, that we need to redefine security comprehensively to include resilience in multiple domains, including the resilience in terms of our ability to protect critical infrastructure. And that leads us to yet another reminder of the importance of cooperation among multiple actors, including the EU and NATO, in addressing some of these challenges, because NATO could help to provide some support, logistical support, will help to defend critical infrastructure, but only up to a point. And I think it is the EU that can play really an important role in ensuring that resilience, in part by reducing reliance on Russia. And that's something that, again, will be analyzed, I'm sure, in depth in the coming panels. I think this is just yet another reminder of the importance of all these issues and the urgency of addressing them. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we have one last question, which I think is a really important one. So I'm going to put it out to everyone on the panel, and I'll give you each 1 minute to address it, as well as anything else you want to say, because we're approaching the end of our time. And this is the question: looking forward after the conflict, how does the West influence Russia and Russians to change the core long-term problem, which the questioner defines as the perception that dominating their neighbors and changing borders is okay in the interests of recreating a sphere of influence or an empire? And I would add to that question the idea that, of course, Europe has to live with Russia, and no matter what one's interpretation is of past behavior, there have been other empires that have collapsed. There have been other long processes that have followed the collapse of those empires. There have been other aggressing powers, even in Europe. And Europe has found ways of dealing with those issues in the past. Europe lives with Germany after World War I and World War II. The British Empire didn't collapse, that easily, and Britain has become a ally and reliable partner. Is there hope that these underlying problems can change somehow? And how does one deal with a country that still maintains, what is it now, some 30 years after the collapse of its empire or the Soviet Union, an aspiration to be such a great power, knowing that you have to live next to this neighbor, probably forever? So I'll throw that one out if you have just a very brief thought on that. And I know 1 minute isn't long to deal with it, but just your kind of direction of thinking. And we'll go in the opposite order from the way that we started out. So I'll go to Tom's first. Tom Kezier.
Yeah.
No, I got mixed up.
A little confused for a second there. I think the West and the EU have tried to influence Russia in the 1990s, and this has only been to a very limited extent successful. And at some point they were confronted with the Putin regime that actually, at the point where they introduced the term sovereign democracy, said we're no longer willing to accept that the West is telling us how to reform and how to become democratic. And we've seen a sort of norm contestation originating from that. So I think the domestic dynamics will always be much stronger, and I think it will be very hard to influence Russia in that regard. I think the change has to come from within Russia itself, and it's a matter of Russia coming to terms with its own imperial past and trying to understand that maybe it can be a great power, but that doesn't mean it has to be therefore a greater Russia. And I think that is really key to the future, because I think Europe and the West have been able to deal with other great powers. But as long as you have a country that sees its great powerness as something that goes hand in hand with extending its territory, then of course there is no place for any good relations between that country and Western countries.
Okay, thank you. Alexandra, you're next.
Well, I fully agree with Tom. So let me, in the interest of time, let me just say that I think much will depend on the evolution of the regime, the Putin regime. We don't know. There are multiple speculations as to what might happen if Putin remains in power. And if the current regime persists, it's very difficult to see how we could influence Nevertheless, we could try to do more in terms of reaching out to the dissidents, both within Russia and outside, working with them to help disseminate alternative narratives, to help to debunk the myth, the narrative that the Russian government has been very successfully, we should say, cultivating. Whether or not we can succeed, I think, again, much will depend on domestic dynamics in Russia, and we don't know at this point in time what will happen. We simply don't know enough about what's happening inside Russia. And that brings me to another point, which is perhaps relevant for us as academics. We need much more knowledge of Russia, people like you, Joan, because I think this is something that we've been lacking in academic circles. After the end of the Cold War, we've lost interest in this has been mentioned before in Russia. We have lost many Russian experts. That means we are in a position where we have a very poor understanding of what happens in Russia. And as long as we have that weakness, I think it will be very difficult to have a significant impact. So in terms of what we can do as academics, I think that's a good point. Thank you.
Okay, Thomas.
Yeah, very quickly, that's the question highlights a key problem because Russia doesn't treat its neighbors as equals. It never has, really. And for instance, you could easily compare. I mean, American diplomats, before they come to Latvia, they try to learn the language. I mean, it's difficult. It's difficult. And why would anyone want to learn Latvian, after all? I mean, we're just 2 million people. It's a small nation. We're a small country. But they try nevertheless. Russian diplomats just wouldn't bother doing this. So Russia doesn't treat its neighbors with respect, while actually Americans do that. And that is, by the way, also the reason why we are so hesitant about welcoming Russians fleeing Russia over the past 7 months, and even more so in the light of recent mobilization, because that's the same attitude. They just don't think that other countries are equally, developed. Russians and Ukrainians were supposedly to be brothers. That's an exaggeration. Ukrainians were not treated like brothers. They were treated as inferior nation, inferior society. And that applies to many of Russia's neighbors. And Russia's neighbors are fed up with this, honestly. And that is also why we don't really feel well about welcoming people who flee Russia at this point. Thank you.
Okay, and Mr. LASIS?
Yeah, thank you. In a nutshell, I think first we need to help Ukraine in all ways we can to win the war. So economic, military, and political support. About the policy, about the long-term policy, I think we can't decide it now. So it will come later. It will depend on the outcome of the war and how we call Russia to account about all the accountability process and about the reparations and how we are rebuilding Ukraine. So this is a very important factor. And I also agree about the domestic situation in Russia. So the changes should come from within. And finally, we also fully agree with those who said that we should continue supporting Russians living abroad in exile, also in Latvia, many of them, including the Russian media, whom we are supporting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that sets the tone for our further discussions. I'd just like to support Alexandra's point that there's a tendency when we see something like this to shy away from studying the aggressor country because it's somehow reprehensible and you don't want to necessarily be associated with it. But on the other hand, it's actually all the more important. And we knew that during the Cold War, there was a lot of study of the Soviet Union. And it produced, well, I guess things turned out better than one might have hoped with the way the Soviet Union collapsed, actually. I don't know if that was due to anything that us Soviet experts did, but at least there was a recognition that it was very important to understand the adversary country. And I think that applies very much so now. Those of you students who are in the audience, who are studying the Russian language, who are studying Russia, who are trying to understand what really is a much more complex society than may have been depicted here. Of course, it's not a uniform society, it's a multi-ethnic society. There are republics within Russia who, are people hold perhaps quite different views, and even the conscription apparently is affecting them more than some of the core areas of Russia. there's a complex sociological structure. And we're seeing that in this, not only the outflux in reaction to conscription, but what Mr. LASIS was referring to, the exodus of those independent media, or they were as independent as they could be early on, many of whom have moved to the Baltic states for refuge. So it's a complex society that we need to understand better. And that's not to justify actions in any way. Understanding is not the same as justifying. It's actually necessary to understand in order to respond. So I think that's a good note to end on for this session, but I would hope that all of you would join us for tomorrow's session, which will look at strategic autonomy and also look at the sanctions regime, EU strategic autonomy, I should say. Tom's will be chairing that panel. It will be live in Latvia. If you're in Latvia, you can contact our Latvian colleagues through the email, which is on the website of the conference, carleton.ca/CES. And if you haven't yet signed up for the link for that session, please do register. And also for the session on October the 6th, when we'll discuss energy and we'll discuss the way forward, which I know that everyone here is, chomping at the bit to talk about. Well, how do we get out of this now? So that will be addressed in the final session. I don't know if we'll offer any solutions, but at least some more thoughts on it. Thank you very much to our panelists. I think this was a great opening discussion, and I really appreciate your willingness to put your views forth and to discuss them so openly and frankly. And I hope that we'll see you all again. And for now, then, we'll say goodbye.